Good afternoon, my name is Andressa, in tourism at the University of São Paulo, and by my side there is Willi Klink, who is also master student in tourism at the University of São Paulo. And I am a member of a MobTur research group led by Thiago Alice. We are here today in this episode to talk about the paper of named We are Waiting for the End, Aging and Immobility in the Tourist City, reading by Antonio Paolo Russo, who kindly accepted our invitation, Filbert Dan Hoed, and Elena Tardivo, published in the Mobilities Journal earlier this year.
Welcome over here, Professor Russo. Thank you for accepting this invitation. Professor Russo is a professor in the Department of Geography at the Faculty of Tourism and Geography of University Rovira I Virgilli of Spain, and coordinator of the H22 Smart Desk project. Thank you very much for having us here today. I would like to start by asking you to tell us a bit about the project, your experience and the main findings on the H2020 project, Smart Desk project.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for your invitation, first of all. The Smart Desk project is actually already finished. We are very recently closed everything. And I am on sabbatical now, so I can relax after 4 years of very hard work. So this was a project that investigated the many dimensions of social exclusion that is rising in tourist cities and start, hopefully, a debate, a societal debate about the forms in which cities can resist or mitigate the worst effects of becoming tourist places, which we have demonstrated as obviously some plus points and some negative points. And these plus points and negative points are very unevenly distributed in local communities. So that was the main focus of our project, to unpack these pluses and minuses, to describe how social exclusion might work, what are the drivers, what are the impacts and the consequences for cities. And one of the most relevant results we got is that it is increasingly difficult for tourist workers, for workers in the tourist sector. Thank you very much. Thanks for your invitation, first of all. The Smart Desk project is actually already finished. We are very recently closed everything, and I am on sabbatical now, so I can relax after 4 years of very hard work. So this was a project that investigated the many dimensions of social exclusion that is rising in tourist cities and start, hopefully, a debate, a societal debate about the forms in which cities can resist or mitigate the worst effects of becoming tourist places, which we have demonstrated as obviously some plus points and some negative points. And these plus points and negative points are very unevenly distributed in local communities. So that was the main focus of our project, to unpack these pluses and minuses, to describe how social exclusion might work, what are the drivers, what are the impacts and the consequences for cities. And one of the most relevant results we got is that it is increasingly difficult for tourist workers, for workers in the tourist sector, to reside and progress in life, to enjoy a good quality of life in the cities in which they work. And this is we are talking about an important part of the local community for which tourist work has been promised as a chance of social mobility. And now they find themselves vulnerable and marginalized. or that mobile populations are changing the way in which places are not only socially constructed or lived in, but also governed. In our project, we also brought to the fore that governments, with a very few exceptions actually, have very little data to design the policies that could be fit to contrast these movements towards social exclusion, and that affected populations mostly do not have a voice in this debate. It is important to note that we also carried out this project during the COVID period, which has been extremely difficult from a practical point of view, but also it's been an eye-opening moment to reveal the kind of vulnerabilities and incrustations that are related with tourist development, basically tourism growth strategies by some of the most important European cities, but also national governments and the European Union, affecting the whole post-COVID recovery debate.
Interesting. As we are talking about tourism and mobilities, could you please talk more about why and how you and the other authors decided to frame tourism from the mobilities perspective?
Yes, tourism, as you probably know, for a long time has been analyzed from an industrial perspective and having a very peculiar spatial footprint. So a sort of a discrete object which is framed by the practices of movement and consumption of the traveling class. And this constitutes a sort of an economic sector or an object of consumption and consuming and attributing a value to local resources. This approach that we can call economic geographic has allowed to bring forward the academic scholarship of tourist studies. Tourist studies, as we know, is mostly founded on this approach, mostly around the issues of planning and management of destinations. And more recently, adding to it the normative perspective of sustainability, so straddling to the environmental debates around tourism. But at the sides of this, other fields, other disciplines, like cultural geography, anthropology, sociology, have addressed more specifically the ontology of tourism, opening up to new ways of studying tourism, new questions like otherness in tourist experience, which is a very important issue for marketing, the position of subaltern host communities, the issues around the quality of life in tourist places, and the scrutiny of the forms of power which are nested in tourist development. These conceptual developments, though they are probably a minority in university curricula, have added layers of interest for tourism as a social fact and a field of practice. I would say that while the hegemonic field of tourist studies has progressively sort of dried down because it has hardly provided solutions to the social issues around tourism with which we are faced, except maybe for tourist marketing, which should be instrumental to the rest of issues of concern. These sort of marginal fields are not so marginal anymore because they are the most adequate to build knowledge about social issues, whether it's the Anthropocene and the environmental crisis, or the issues of justice and societal mobility around tourism, or the crafting of alternative post-capitalist responses to the deadlocks which the continuous expansion of tourism is facing. So the mobilities paradigm that was inaugurated by John Urry and then picked up by many other authors in the field offers a new perspective and a method that is transversal across all these societal debates. It also involves a reconceptualization of life and the economy as an assemblage of movements at different scales, which invites to consider tourism not just in the field of the extraordinary, and thus treated as a distinctive object of analysis, but to situate it within a continuum of forms of inhabiting, reproducing, and attaching value to space. It is useful to understand the genealogy of tourist spaces and the structure of societies therein, but also to analyze the experience of tourists as an assemblage, a putting together of mobile objects and mobile practices. This approach unpacks the structures of power and agency that are nested in tourism and in the operations of the tourism industry, and can reveal the meanings of space that are assumed when space is used by different relationally engaged but simultaneously empowered population groups. It invites us to consider how mobility and immobility, the privilege of being mobile and the stuckness to place, are co-constitutive of one another, but also provide new layers of meaning to velocity and adaptation. Finally, it is a very apt framework to disentangle the societal innovations that should be taken into account for a serious fight against climate change. Do we need to move less versus the right to move? That is one of the great pillars of advanced democratic constitutions. How can we cover this gap?
And especially discussing over here about your article that you published with your colleagues at the Mobilities journals, framing the analysis on Venice, Italy, uh, and illustrating the issues caused by overtures on this city. For example, old residents have difficult to access saturated areas that are covered by tourism. This activity, how tourism impacts walking mobilities of cities and residents, especially the older ones that you frame on this article.
Yeah, this is only one of the ways that we explore in this domain. But we do that in terms of mobility practices. And the scholarship has engaged with what we call motility, so the capacity to be mobile, which can be bodily capacity, fitness to be mobile, or economic capacity, or maybe even institutional capacity, the legitimation to be able to move freely around, or a combination of all that. And this is framed as power, biopower, power of life, I would call it, as it frames one of the essential dimensions of contemporary lives. And from this perspective, modalities are uneven. They constrain one another, negotiate the hegemony over space, and ultimately they reproduce a space in destinations and across the globe. So Venice was one of the case studies in Smartest, one where we wanted to talk about this seeming endless destiny of the city towards becoming just a tourist attraction, not a city anymore. And we have to say that Venice is also a case study that has been studied by many authors over the last decade, because it's sort of an exemplary place of what can go wrong with tourism development. So naturally, many people have engaged with that. So in our paper in the Mobilities Journal, we have looked at the specific issue of how one very powerful form of mobility, that of visitors to Venice, which is in itself a quintessential slow space, a slow city. So how the mobility of visitors intersects and interferes with the mobility of residents, which is essential for the social reproduction of this population group. And in particular with the mobile practices of the older residents, which are, we can consider them the weakest, the most vulnerable in terms of bodily fitness, and at the same time, those that are most dependent on being mobile in the city. Walking out of home to do shopping, to visit relatives and friends, to engage in everyday activities. In a city like Venice, the paradox is that the slow mobility that invites visitors through the landscape, by foot or water is the city's main selling point from a visitor point of view. People go to Venice because it's unique, and it is unique because, among other things, is one city where you can only walk around. But this is sort of undetachable from the fast mobility of international travelers that have to reach the destination. So visitors visit the city slowly, but they are very mobile in arriving to the city. And whereas the slow mobility of residents was once considered a privilege, Venetians are very proud to live in a city like that is world famous for its heritage, for its history, and for its urban structure. Now this privilege is becoming an hindrance because space is occupied and transformed by visitor mobility. In the space of Venice, what is a spectacle for some has become a burden to others. But Venice is what it is, a unique lived city of culture and history. Because of its resident population over the centuries, we cannot understand what Venice is and how it has become as it is, if not for the fact that it's a living city with a resident population. And if this is lost, as it is happening, half of the population of the city lost over the last 30 years that coincide with the explosion of mass tourism in the city, Venice won't stay the same, won't be the same. It won't be attractive as it is, have this kind of privilege in its landscape. In all that, we recognize that all the older Venetian residents have capacity to adapt, to reconfigure and reconstruct their daily routines, to change habits, to navigate new routes, to avoid having to negotiate the city with tourists. But they can only do that to a certain extent. And they themselves, the subjects of our research, the people we interviewed, are acknowledging the limits to this adaptation. And the fact that's what the title says, that maybe they will be the last generation of stable residents that will be allowed to live in this privilege.
Interesting. In this paper mentions a lot of negative impacts of tourism, such as mass tourism, overcrowding, trash and noise pollution, and hindrances, as tourists stopped taking photos everywhere and anytime, especially in destinations like Venice. In your opinion, what the tourism management can do to avoid or decrease the negative impacts of the mass tourism in the local community?
Okay, in this specific paper, we don't analyze solution. We look at the facts and how they are evolving, okay? But in many other projects I have been involved, like in Smartest, in many other case studies, we do attempt to seek solutions. Although I have to say, we come from 30 years of looking for solutions to these problems, 40 maybe. And the fact that basically no solutions have been found to the impacts of over-tourism is a sign that you have to do something different. You have to think out of the box. You have to, maybe even to transform the regime on which tourism growth is produced. We do look at the fact that top-down interventions can be ineffective and sometimes unrealistic. And the thing is that the urban crisis produced by the hypermobility of tourism and other related mobilities, which is a crisis of social justice, a crisis of access, a crisis of hegemony over common resources, a crisis of democracy, is not solved in the domain of tourism management. I mean, good tourism management and good tourism planning can help places to sell themselves better, to make the provision of services to tourists more efficient, maybe to ease some of the worst environmental effects locally. But it doesn't change the position of local communities, which, using the mobilities lens, are always and inevitably resituated by tourism, and the more so in context of growth. What really counts are housing policies, labor policies, welfare, health policies, transport policies, and urban design. And so the idea that the problem of tourism is solved outside of the tourism domain into the wider realm of urban policy, of the urban justice, is very slowly, maybe too slowly, becoming the real domain of these tourist transitions for cities that have reached this kind of acknowledgement. These are crises I was talking about that align in some way with the climate challenge.
Mhm.
So if humanity does finally something significant to reduce the emissions provoked by travel, this will have a very interesting repercussions locally, also on the social side. But the debate on the future of cities is not there yet.
Uh, Bringing this discussion for Latin America, for example, there's another contest, a huge difference between Latin America and Europe about tourism. We do not see over tourism like we see in Europe nowadays, especially in cities, large cities like São Paulo and Rio. How this can be like an advantage to make destinations more accessible? Destinations more accessible.
Yeah, it is true that cities like Sao Paulo, Rio, uh, are not experiencing what is commonly understood as over tourism, which anyway it's a very complex and holistic construct
Mhm.
that it builds on anthropic pressure, revalorization processes, discourse, social perception, and scale. So it is possible that Rio, I know Rio, I don't know Sao Paulo, but I know
Mhm.
very well Rio. Rio is not over touristed, but certain attractions in Rio, certain places in Rio, and their social environment are under severe tourist pressure. Certainly, though, these cities may be experiencing the first rising signs of tourism becoming a challenge for local communities, and not only the urban poor, which is where everybody is looking at, who may be making a living thanks to tourism, but at the same time, their livelihoods are progressively taken away from them through urban renaissance projects, pacification of favela, you mean it.
Mhm.
But also the low income or middle income, middle classes whose habitats are progressively becoming touristic. If we look at the data on the concentration of Airbnbs, for instance, which is one of the main dimensions everybody's focusing on when we have this debate, and we look at housing prices in Rio and Sao Paulo, and I was very recently aware that one of your colleagues, Rita Cassia from
Mhm.
USP,
Yep.
is working on that, or Raquel Rornik also has published a lot on that. Or when we look at the situation of tourism workers and migrants throughout the city of the global south, but also in North America and now in Europe, we realize that there are processes of social exclusion that are picking a lot of force. So yes, maybe because they are not so crowded yet, and they retain a sense of the authentic that these cities offer to their international visitors. And in any case, I don't like the word authentic when we use it in tourist studies, because what is authentic? But so because of that, they have an advantage to attract new visitors, new markets that maybe have more compatible practices of use of place with respect to the old markets. But the question is how the local communities are responding to all that.
Mm.
If it is bringing diffuse prosperity, or it is just making a few people richer and push many other people to the margins of the urban. And we know that this is happening in the West. Probably it is also the case of the global South, and cities like Sao Paulo and Rio might be experiencing something like that.
Yeah, for sure. And not only gentrification, but also new types of tourism appears in this new urban tourism context. Think about that. Do you think live like a local and as if tourists as a way to avoid mass tourism? Do you think there's different context profiles, interactions, and behaviors between these categories, these emergent categories, and the typical tourists?
Look, at one level, probably it is like you say, because what we call post-tourists or new generation of global travelers, they probably have more capacity to use the local assets in a better way than when we think about destination of the 60s, where you had like in the Europe, German visitors only drinking German beer and not really connecting with the place at all. Okay, but on another dimension, another layer of analysis, we have to understand that this new generation of travelers, they are also tourists. They have bodies, and through the body, whether they like it or not, they exert power over place. And they move a lot of money, possibly more than traditional mass tourists. So their practices can be different. They can be more compatible with maintaining the qualities of place. They can be less intrusive of original habitats, but not necessarily. So all this jargon about experience the authentic, live like a local, blah, blah, that is conveyed interestingly by those companies that today are responsible for the more dramatic transformation of cities. They end up altering the way in which people live in their own city, transforming food markets, commercial supply, and real estate markets around the world. So the true post-capitalist transitions, those that have really happened, that we expect when we talk about the collaborative economy, for instance, are really anecdotal and only experienced by a great minority of travelers. I'm talking about, for example, about volunteer tourism, homestays, genuine homestays, not Airbnbs, like home exchanges, free accommodation at homes, proximity travel using non-contaminating transport means, heritage spaces managed directly as common resources by local communities. So in substance, tourism is a capitalistic industry. It is one of the places of neoliberal capital accumulation, and there seem to be very little alternatives in capitalism that would change the current situation in terms of the effects that tourism produces over place. So fighting the climate change or achieving a more equitable societies are all options to be found outside this dominant capitalist regime. And we still have to invent that, I think.
And knowing that this flows, and we can call it off the beaten tracks and itineraries, are spreading throughout the city, not only staying on the city center, of city areas, how new urban tourism really can be understood as an alternative to reduce these impacts caused by gentrification and mass tourism.
Look, again, on one level, the level of pure tourist marketing, it makes sense to be able to spread the tourism so that there is less pressure on city centers, for instance, and there are more benefits that are arriving to peripheral communities that are more in need of that. But I don't believe that this is realistic and not necessarily a good thing. Why? Certainly, you have to see the periphery of the most well-trodden tourist destinations to experience something authentic or the local culture and ways of life. This strategy has become, for many destinations, the way to tourismify peripheries once the center are already worn out. And from the point of view of the industry, to spread capital accumulation and rent extractions to areas that until now were not under the spotlight. So this dispersion mantra in place promotion just means that we are shifting and reproducing the issues in other parts of our destinations. And this has happened very fast over the last 20, 30 years. So there are cases like London. London, nobody lives in the center of London anymore. Not because of tourism, because of many other things, because of finance, because of a retail trade. So people, the real Londoners live in the peripheries, and the peripheries of London have become very interesting places also. But they are also suffering from the effects of over-tourism. Same in Barcelona, same in Paris, and many other places. And I remember when I was in Rio, there was a very interesting discussion. Well, the centro de Rio was not on the tourist map 15 years ago, but even though it's a very interesting historical area, but the middle classes don't go there. It is not part of the promotional brochure of Rio de Janeiro until they found out that there is a very big space of opportunity for that, as it is with favelas, the most nice ones, as it is even for the Baixada Fluminense, for the topic of samba and local traditions. So this machinery is pushing tourism to these other places. So again, I think that alternative tourism, if there exists an alternative tourism, has to be founded on a fundamental revision of access, numbers, planning frameworks, labor relations, housing rights. Otherwise, when we are finished to tourismify what is the core, we are going to tourismify the periphery, and nothing will change from this point of view.
Unfortunately, our interview is over. Is ending, and the final question that I want to do to you is that if you want to give you some advice for younger researchers like me and Billy, or do you want to spread a final message, or do you want to talk about the future agenda, research agendas that you are interested in? Please.
Yeah, for me, for young researchers from the field of tourism like you, my suggestion is to look at the way in which these other fields, such as human geography, critical geography, cultural studies, anthropology, critical economy and planning, have engaged with tourism. Maybe not everything goes in your study curriculum, but there is a lot that is happening in these marginal, peripheral fields, if you want. And that helps really engaging, unpacking, not so much the how much questions. The big questions is how many tourists can we attract? How much infrastructure do we need for that? Which already is something that permeates a lot of the research on tourism. But instead to focus on other big questions, the where, the how, the who, the why of tourism and its impacts, to learn to criticize all that, to have a critical view about all that. The nuances on a neoliberal idea that all tourism is good and all tourist development favors society, which are, I think, much more transcendental questions if you want our research to be transformational and aware of the debates that fly around. We have to learn to be critical, and sometimes in tourism study, in the core of tourism study, we don't find this kind of answers. And conversely, for young researchers that are working in those fields, in anthropology, in planning, whatever, my recommendation would be to engage with tourism and mobilities as a fantastic laboratory of one of the big issues for the society and the planet that we are looking for.
Thank you very much, Professor, for our time, for accepting this invitation for this interview. We appreciated this a lot, this discussion. And
the link of the paper, we are waiting for the ending in mobility in the tourist city is available in the comments below. And if you like this episode, keep watching the other ones that are coming up. Thank you so much, Professor, for your time.
Thank you guys, and bring my salutations to Tiago. I am seeing anyway in 1 month in Italy.
Thank you very much,
Yes,
Professor.
that was
Bye
great.
bye. Ciao
Bye
ciao.
bye. Bye bye. Thank
Bye
you.
bye. Thank you.